All right, welcome to another open source office hours. It's Wednesday morning here in sunny California. All right, so we'll start like we usually do with any announcements. Did we push anything out that we want to announce?
I've been making a lot of small bug fixes and stuff like that, mostly in ShareJS and LiveDB. There were a lot of issues that have been ignored for a long time, so I've been fixing kind of core problems we've been seeing a lot in production. So it should be, in general, now much less leaky and more reliable and less buggy. That's the main thing I've got.
Yeah, I don't have too much progress to report. What about you guys?
Well, I know that Arthur fixed his LiveDB Mongo memory driver. Like Nate said last time, he added next stick and it started to work.
Cool.
That's pretty much it.
Cool.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, Ian had some questions queued up, so maybe we should go over those.
Yeah, that shouldn't take too long. So here's one from the mailing list. Someone's asking about LiveDB has a configuration option, extra DB, and so this is used to register extra database backends, which can be notified when operations are submitted, and they can also be used in queries. But the question is, how can I do extra DB's queries from a Derby 0.6 model?
It's not changed. You just specify with the query what the source is as the third parameter. So the first parameter is the collection. The second parameter is the actual query. I call it the expression, but it's like in Mongo that object that represents a query. And the third part is the backend name. So it defaults to whatever your main thing is, and then you can specify something else. So we use Elasticsearch as a LiveDB backend, actually. And so for our Elasticsearch queries, it just has a third parameter.
And it's just a string?
Yes, it's the name of the backend.
All right, well, that answers that.
Yeah, it's pretty simple.
All right, and then this one is a little more generic, but something I think people occasionally run into and then might not know how to debug, which is when you get a server-client rendering mismatch. And we've seen it it comes up pretty often with like if you're rendering a date and you're not considering a time zone, so it renders like the server's time on the server, and then the client tries to attach and it notices that the time is different.
Or if you try and use relative dates, that's also a problem because they actually, separate from the time zone issue, like at least if you render a time in a time zone, then it'll be the same on the server and the client. But if it's a relative time, what you're actually rendering is the time, your time now, because the relative is actually, right, like it's actually the difference between now and the time, and then also a time zone. So, well, actually, no, wait, not a time zone, my bad. Absolute times have to be in time zones, but relative times aren't in time zones. It's just the fact that you're rendering a difference rather than rendering a time. So we actually have this problem in our app right now. If you ever render a relative time, you need to render it from like the same time on the server and the client, and rendering happens again on the client is how it like actually works. So by definition, it's going to be happening at a different time. If you just render a relative time based on now, quote unquote, you actually have to pass in the time as an argument to the function that's computing the difference. So what you should be doing is you should be storing the time at which you render somewhere that's sent from the server to the client, so that the client can use the same time that the server used. Does that make sense? So in general, the way that Derby handles this could be like a little bit smoother, to be honest. Like it could do diffing instead of what it currently does. What it currently does is it tries to render the page on the client the same way it rendered it on the server. And if it encounters any differences at all, in production, it doesn't actually break the page. It actually notices that something's different and then stops rendering and then re-renders everything. But that's a lot slower because it has to replace the entire page. So in development, to discourage that, we just throw an error so that you actually fix the problem. And the error is usually either like client-server render mismatch, or it'll be it'll also sometimes say like there's a I'd like to actually make this error better, but it basically will tell you like that it can't modify a character that's like out of range because that code needs a try-catch in it. But basically, what's going on there is that the DOM that's being rendered client-side is different than the server for whatever reason. Like it could be the time, it could be because the sort order is different. If you're not using sorting logic that's based on like a consistent thing, like you can't use locale compare, for example, because locale compare on the server isn't the same as it is on the client. Because what Node.js's locale is might have different rules than what the client's locale is. So whenever you're using like some sort of comparison or some sort of a thing that relies on something that could possibly be different, it could lead to this bug. The other thing that's very frequently the cause of this bug is if your HTML is not super strict. Derby's not crazy smart about understanding the very complicated rules of HTML because, frankly, it's just not worth implementing. But HTML has funny rules, like if you have a paragraph that's not closed, followed by another paragraph or a div or some other block element, for example, it implicitly closes that paragraph. But to code all of that into Derby would be not really a good use of time and would make it slower. HTML parsers are really, really complicated, and so basically Derby just freaks out if your HTML isn't like every single tag closed correctly. And also the other thing that's important is that you correctly use like all of the elements that HTML will infer. So there's rules about HTML parsing, like if you have a table with a TR in it, that's actually valid from the DOM perspective, but there's a rule in HTML which is when a browser renders a table with a TR in it, HTML parsing rules are that it creates a T-body. And so it's going to end up creating a different DOM in the client because the DOM allows that to not be there. But the HTML rendering rules make it happen. They like insert the T-body through magic. So basically, anywhere where like there could be a discrepancy, all you have to really do is just specify all of the elements that like HTML is going to implicitly create during HTML parsing. So it's pretty simple. If you just write good, clean HTML, you won't run into problems. But sometimes that's the problem, is your HTML syntax is invalid, or you just like are missing an element that's implied. And Derby's not smart enough to understand the difference on purpose. So yeah, that's the main set of things. Check your HTML, make sure everything's very strictly valid, and more than valid, it should actually just be like strict. Include all the elements that would be implied by HTML parsing rules, and make sure that things are the same on server and the client.
Yeah, those all make sense, and I think like I've definitely seen those both here and some people asking about it. what I'm wondering too, though, is like, what are some ways to narrow down what that is? Like, is that what you
Well,
mean
Derby
by?
tells you what exactly it got stuck on. So it actually in the console gives you literally the element that it was stuck on when it was off. So this used to be a bigger problem because Derby, the last version of Derby, gave you no context, but the current version of Derby logs out both the containing element that it was working on, as well as the element that it's like currently trying to attach, which might be null if it's at the end. But basically, it literally logs out like where the problem is in the console. So just look at it.
So just being aware that, you know, if you see something like a table, it's probably like you're not doing that strictly, and then otherwise looking your view for think about
what could be different.
Yeah. On the
So
client.
think about sort orders, data that could be different. Times are especially likely to be an issue, and just HTML structure.
Cool. So actually this feeds in really well to this other question I got from someone who's actually working on Angular 2, and they're like looking at strategies for doing server-side rendering, and he's curious if we're hydrating client-side, which I think you're kind of describing the attachment is like that, right? Where
I mean, I don't know what the definition of hydrate is because it's just kind of an English word, but
right. I guess what from their or what his perspective is saying, does the client re-render the page, or does it get the model and state data in the server render view so it can simply hydrate and not re-render anything? But it sounds like somewhere in between, right?
It's kind of in between. So the way it works is that it doesn't actually do a full render on the client because basically there's just 3 different modes of rendering. There's server rendering, which actually does a lot of shortcuts to like avoid doing work. So server rendering doesn't set up event listeners. It doesn't set up a bunch of stuff that actually has a lot of overhead, which makes server rendering faster. It goes directly into HTML. So it goes from template objects directly into HTML and never creates a DOM-like object tree. It only has the template object tree, which is very different than how React works and how all the other server-side rendering systems work. It's much more efficient. Then the second main mode is client-side rendering. What it does is as it renders, it creates DOM. So it uses things like document create element, and every single thing that has like an HTML tag has an analog where it just creates a DOM element or it adds an attribute or whatever is the appropriate thing. And then the third mode is called attachment. Attachment is basically the same thing as the DOM rendering, except that instead of creating the elements, it just finds the elements that are currently there and does what it would do to the element it created to the element that already is in the page. So it's sort of like re-rendering, except that it's not doing the element creation, and it's like only doing the stuff where it like attaches events, or it will do stuff like there's some stuff that's slightly different because when you server render HTML and you have like multiple text nodes next to each other, obviously that just becomes one text node because there's no way to like break apart multiple pieces of continuous text. It just becomes a text node when you parse it as HTML. Mm-hmm. And so on the client side, what happens is that text is looked at and then split apart based on the content. Which is one of the reasons why attaching is so touchy, is that the text has to be precisely the same in order for that to work. That's actually something I've considered trying to figure out a way to be more lenient about, because that runs into some issues, to make a long story short. What would be nice to be able to do is to do a diffing thing like React does, where it actually could like make a more minimal change, but I don't know if that's actually worth it or not, so I haven't really prioritized yet. But so it's a very efficient strategy when it works. The only problem is that if somebody modifies the page through a variety of means during rendering, it breaks. So like if there's other code on the page, like a Chrome extension that modifies the page, or if somebody manages to like use something that modifies the DOM before Derby's finished loading, or if a developer like puts some code in that changes the page while it's rendering before Derby's done attaching, because they didn't use like the proper kind of sequencing of things, it can break a lot. So I haven't decided like how much effort to put into making it like super resilient versus like how much effort to put into just generally like trying to avoid those situations by adding other constructs, if that makes any sense. Like for example, Derby could have like really good tools for dealing with rendering times and like sorting and the things that are the common problems, and that way people just won't run into the issues as much because there'll be like a canonical way that you use times. And so there's kind of like two approaches. Is like one is like make great tools so that patch over like the tricky parts, and the other one is like make it more resilient to when people don't do it right.
Right.
And some of that's unavoidable. Like people running Chrome extensions is not something that you can control. So Derby has to deal with that situation somehow. And we actually have issues like in our app too with that. So it's a real problem.
Okay. You said the thing about the text nodes. I wasn't actually quite clear on that. Is that like a...
Well, so if you're client-side rendering, you can just make two text nodes next to each other, right? So you can make like one text node that says hi, and then another text node that says Ian, right? And you can put them next to each other. And what that looks like in HTML land is one text node, because hi Ian is just text.
Right.
So you can't have continuous text that produces multiple nodes in HTML. But if you're creating DOM elements, like if I say, create text node, and then I say create text node, and I append them both next to each other, I can change them independently.
Right.
So when Derby does bindings to text, it actually creates multiple nodes that are all right next to each other that aren't separated by anything. But
on the server, that doesn't happen.
On the server, you can't, because there's no way to split them. So the two options are, one, the current method, which is that we basically just like figure it out on the client and split it apart. So that's one of the few places where attaching is different than the regular rendering mode, is it has to deal with these like weird edge cases because there's no way to represent that in HTML. The other option would be to put something in there that would make it have multiple text nodes, then take the separator out. So for example, we could put comments in that their purpose would just be to break apart the text. But basically the trade-off is like it makes messier HTML. And one of the things that I was striving for in Derby 0.6 is like you'll notice that the HTML is actually really clean. It doesn't have any extra crap in it. It doesn't have like random new IDs in it or like comments. All the comments that are needed to do wrapping of stuff for having various DOM regions that can be bound to, those are all added in the client and not in the server render. There's actually one exception, which is there's something I want to clean up. But in general, Derby is actually it generates very nice HTML when it generates HTML. It doesn't have any extra crap in it. And so I'm a little bit less excited about like putting stuff in there that's going to make the HTML gross. Yeah.
Cool. I think this has been really informative. Turn this into a guide, or both of these together will be, solid reading. And then they had other two questions, which I think I already know the answer. But so am I right in saying that the client-side routing uses an adaptation of the express router? That's currently Trax, right?
Yeah. So Trax is just a wrapper around the history API and the express router. So currently, we're just including a somewhat old version of the express router. We're going to rewrite it and I'm going to continue just wrapping the Express router or using another node module that does. Somebody pointed at me to actually some library that somebody did where they like pulled the router out of Express, so I'll evaluate that and see if that might make sense so that we don't have to maintain that. But yeah, I'm gonna take the router out of Derby's default install before declaring 0.6 final. It's one of the few remaining tasks. Gotten to a point with bugs where I'm actually okay with it. I think there's probably a few bugs left, but actually it's pretty stable at this point, and the really bad binding bugs are all resolved. There's definitely some wacky edge cases where you can't pass like really complicated things around in templates, and eventually it'd be great if there weren't any like sharp edges like that, but they're not going to be API incompatible changes, so that's cool to just release. So the really big remaining things are removing a couple deprecated things. We switched from view name to view is, and like element to tag in one place, and ripping out the router by default. I think that, oh, and then the last thing that I still have is I want to make a final call on how styles get included with components and how component dependencies work. That's the final set of work. Oh, cool. Very close, actually. All those things are very doable.
Located, was it template attributes or something?
I was saying, like, yeah, you can like pass around, like, you can do stuff that looks like it would work in templates that doesn't still. Right. Like the syntax is extremely expressive and therefore hard to implement. And there's just a lot of edge cases that I'm like not going to actually deal with correctly in this release. I mean, obviously it mostly works, but the point I'm making is like I'm kind of drawing the line at like all of the really bad bindings bugs have been fixed that I'm aware of, and I think that work is sufficiently done. But the really complicated like template binding stuff is that's remaining mostly has to do with like, oh, it looks like you should be able to do this, but you can't because of some complicated internal reason. Like, right. Oh, it looks like I should just be able to pass this complicated expression into this view, and when something changes, it should automatically update, and it doesn't. Is like the majority of them are just doesn't update things that you'd think it would, for example.
Mm-hmm. So basically, you're saying punting on that for 0.
Yeah, punting on that for 0.6. That's going to require a big rewrite of how bindings actually work under the hood, and that's probably 0.7.
Got it. Cool. And then one other quick thing was, are you able to render partials in Derby on the server side or just full pages? Of course, you can render partials.
Yep.
Where is the best place to look for that API? Is that like the thing that John did? That I believe I have an example
of. There's a few ways to do it, which might not be ideal, but one way to do it is if you're in a component, there's a method to just like render a view from that component's namespace. So basically you can just say like get on the component, and it'll actually get you HTML. And you can pass it a name that's relative to that component, which will return the HTML for that thing. Same thing for pages. So the method is just component.get or page.get. That's basically how you do it. So you like basically like one way to do it is just to create a page, populate the page's model with some data, and then get the output there. If you just want to do it for server-side rendering of HTML, the best example is actually what Eric did for the email templates. You might want to just make a gist of that. But you can basically like create a page, and then you can say page.model.data equals, and then set a whole object on it all at once, and then use page.get, basically, to make a long story short.
We're just the same model, like model.set. Oops.
You can use model.set, but you can also just actually directly set model.data, which is model.data is just a reference to the root of the model's data tree. Like the entire object model is just one giant tree.
Like
so
page.model.data.
Yeah, so you can, if you want to, you can just manually set like the whole data all at once. If like you're doing server rendering, it makes sense. It's just easier. Yeah.
Cool.
That's actually what Derby does for components too. Like if you're in a component, page.model.data is actually a reference to that component's like tree. That's actually how Derby lookups work. Is it starts from model.data. It's much cheaper than going through the model's getter method. It's less overhead.
Oh, I see we have a new question here from Mateo. Our real time, all right.
Our aggregation queries must update in the views when subscribed to. I don't believe that aggregation queries currently live bound. I haven't actually spent any time thinking about it yet. The only way to make them rerun would be to rerun the whole aggregation query whenever any document in the collection changes, which is really inefficient to do in like production, especially because aggregation queries can be really hard. Like they can just inherently be slow. So I believe right now it's not implemented. It could be implemented, but in practice, I suspect that you probably wouldn't want to use a lot of polling on aggregation queries anyway, because it probably would overload Mongo pretty quickly.
Yeah, so hi guys.
Hey.
I finally made it. My question was because this week we tried to do some statistics on collections, and we did them. We tried to do them in several ways.
Yep.
One of these ways was using aggregation queries. Excuse me. One of these ways was aggregation queries, and the other way was using reactive functions.
Yep.
So we, for most of them, sorry, I need to respond to a phone call.
No worries.
It will be very quick.
All right.
Well, regardless, I don't think it's currently supported. It probably could be fixed to work. It would inherently be very difficult to optimize at the framework level. And in practice, I would expect it probably wouldn't be a good idea.
If someone, I mean, if you did it so that there's always, it took the match, right, and then you polled against that instead of, right, like then it wouldn't be the whole collection, right, like, but it could be subscribed to the filter.
Yeah, that's true. If the aggregation query were structured in the way that like Mongo recommends, where you have the match at the beginning, which you should be doing anyway because it uses indexes better, then yeah, Derby could probably do some filtering on it. But yeah, I mean, sure, like, I'm pretty sure the answer is it's not currently supported. Yes, it could be added, but in practice, you'd have to be really careful that you're not doing a really expensive query.
Okay, so I'm sorry for the before.
No worries.
The thing is, so what I would need to have live bound statistics on, let's say, a dashboard. So I have my dashboards which updates live counts or other.
I mean, it's just a legitimately difficult problem. Like, this is just actually a hard problem.
Right.
So you could do a variety of things, and like this really, it doesn't have anything to do with Derby in particular. It's just like a system level problem. You could either, as data changes, compute the output and then store it somewhere so that it's fast to retrieve, or you can make retrieving the data expensive and compute it every time. And how often you compute it is like the tricky part, and like how expensive it is to compute. So like it just depends a lot on the situation, how many different filters you have on the data. If like, for example, if you have a very read heavy workload, like if clients are mostly just rendering something, and very rarely relative to the amount of reading is it writing, then you're definitely better off actually persisting that data. But doing that is difficult because like whenever the data changes, you have to make sure you update the thing. So how do you make sure that you never mess that up? Because if you mess it up, then it will be broken forever. So you need to have ways to recompute it in cases where it gets off. You need to make sure that you have a high reliability of writing it. This is just like a generically difficult problem.
I see.
I can go into it, but it's like literally like a lecture on how do you do this.
Of course.
So
but,
I'd say the shortest answer I can give you, since we don't have a lot of time, is you should think about like, should I be polling this? Should I be like occasionally checking the current value? Or should I be writing the value out proactively as the data changes? Those are like the basic two options you have.
And we've used both here at Lever, and we've faced challenges with both.
Yeah, they're both hard for their own reasons.
Right, and if you look at like most other dashboards or analytics stuff, like even the ones that are real time, they just generally update themselves every 10 or 30 seconds, right?
Yeah.
Like behind the scenes, it's not changing to reacting to every change. It's really just like maybe reaggregating. Yeah, I mean, like May said, it depends on the experience, but it really, Also, in your application, like how important is it that they see the change on every single document change, or is it that they, someone just needs to know that like as they're looking at it, things will update? Because if that's the case, then polling every 10 seconds or 30 seconds might be.
Yeah, like is it that you're showing the count of something that the user's interacting with, and so it's something that they can count, like literally, like if there's like 12 items on the page and you can literally count the 12 items and you show a sum at the top that says 12. If that says 10, you've got a real big problem because users are going to notice. So you at least need to message in that case that like the count might be out of sync with the thing that the user can actually calculate themselves. But ideally it's just not out of sync in that case. If it's something where the user's not directly manipulating it, but they're just kind of monitoring something that's like generally speaking happening, like for example, if you're just monitoring server statistics, like, hey, is the server using a lot of CPU right now? Or hey, is there a lot of traffic to my website? It's like, I'm not actually like directly manipulating the traffic to my website like I might if I'm in a CRM and I want to see the count of like how many people are in a particular bucket. I might actually modify that directly. So it really like, what is the right strategy depends a lot on the user experience. It depends a lot on the implementation difficulty, and it's actually just something you have to think through. Like, what is the right thing for the user? What solves the user need?
Okay, so now I have a question which popped in my mind, talking about how many changes would be thrown. When I update, let's say, a bug of items in a collection. So I say I push an array, or I push several items near to one each other. So I do several model.add very quickly. Does the change event be thrown a lot, or does it? Sorry, does it be thrown?
Yeah, there's not a lot of batching.
In a while, or at every add?
Everything generally emits events. So there's various ways that you could imagine that could be optimized, but it gets very tricky for a long, long list of reasons why. But in general, every single thing is an event.
Okay.
There are some open areas for optimization with that, but some of that stuff is actually very tricky, given that Derby is, and Racer and Share are fundamentally imperative code. It's easier to do aggregation of changes with purely functional code, which is why people who are using stuff like Ohm brag about that. Because as long as you can recompute the entire state of the entire world, and there's no like weird state bleeding, it's safe to kind of like ignore transitory states, and then figure out at the end what the current state is. But in imperative code, because we have like listeners and stuff, you might do all sorts of bad things. Like you might modify the DOM based on an event, which then other code relies on that having happened in a very particular order. So there's a good reason why imperative event-based code has to a lot of times emit a lot of events. It's not an easy thing to optimize. You usually have to give some sort of tooling to the user of the framework to like do the explicitly mention that the intention is for these things to be aggregated together. So either having bulk methods or having like a mode where you say like, okay, I'm going to start doing bulk actions now, and then okay, now I'm done doing bulk actions, go update everything. And generally, Derby doesn't have a lot of stuff like that yet. So there's ways to, these are pretty generic classic problems actually. Like this isn't even specific to web frameworks. This is like a generic computer science algorithm kind of thing.
Yeah, of course. But my question was, it was this kind of problem already?
Yeah, it is. I mean, most web frameworks actually have this problem. Like Angular and Ember and everything, pretty much everything has this exact problem.
Yeah.
This is extremely common, that like every single change ends up creating lots of events.
Okay. So yeah, basically if I add multiple objects, I will have multiple events fired, which means that if I register a reactive function to that collection, if I add 5 records to that collection, the reactive functions would be called 5 times.
Yeah, well, so obviously that's not ideal. One thing you can do now is you can like explicitly stop the reactive function and restart it again later. It's a little bit like obviously annoying, but you can do that.
Didn't you debounce inside the reactive function? Is that what you mean?
No, because the reactive function will get called directly.
But I mean, you can return it early.
Yeah, but that'll end up mutating the data. The reactive functions you can't like not return. You have to return the output.
Oh, right.
So with reactive functions, you have less control. Like, keep in mind, reactive functions are designed to be very, very flexible and very, very useful, but not very efficient. Like they're they are the like really nice abstraction that was built up on top of the racer event system. But that's all they are. They're just an abstraction. So like you can do everything you can do with reactive functions manually, and you can often do it much more efficiently if you just manually handle like model on style events. And so if you want to be really efficient, you often have to do more work. So you have to like manually listen to specific events that you care about, and you could debounce that before you do your set. Or the other thing you can do that actually we do sometimes is similar to a reactive function. You might define an update function that does some computation, but rather than calling it using model start, which is like a obviously really like generic, not super optimized pattern, you could manually call your update function yourself when you know it changes. So model start is great for like the 95% case where you don't have to optimize, but there's always going to be 5% you have to optimize. And you should just basically like see what the critical path is and gradually like unroll some of the model starts into more optimized code.
Okay, because I was thinking for my specific case to instead of using aggregation queries, using reactive functions on the change event on the collection. Because in our cases, we have collections which are not updated very often, but when they are updated, lots of records are updated.
Yeah, I mean, that might be the right way to do it, though it mostly has to do with can you load all that data into the client. So if you can, then great. If you can't, then you're going to have to do something on the server. So
yeah, of course.
Mostly depends on that.
How much data?
I mean, one thing you can do actually is you can just run an aggregation query and then set the entire output of the aggregation query in a document. You could even do this in a polling interval. Like you can have a server that is just constantly like running an aggregation query every minute, let's say, right? Like let's say that this is not critical that the user sees the data that like literally as it happens, like the nanosecond it happens, but you know, every minute interval is great, right? Let's say that. So you could just simply run a Mongo aggregation query on the server. You could then set diff the entire output of that to a document, and that will then update all the clients. That might be the most efficient way to do it if a lot of clients are looking at the same aggregation. But if every client's looking at a very different aggregation, that might not be a good way to do it. So yeah, like I said before, like fan out, fan in is like a classic like problem.
Yeah, this was the third possibility we had, because we had aggregation queries, we had reactive functions, or we have computing the statistics after the computation and change those statistics when the computation finishes. Because for our specific case, the statistics change only after the computation on the server side finishes. So
well, if it's only on the server side, then you can also even know when it's updated. Instead of polling it, you might be able to just compute it when you know it changes. So that might be even more efficient. But like I said, it depends a lot on the specific use cases and your workflow and stuff like that. All right, we should wrap up. Hope that was helpful. I'm going to be gone the next 2 weeks because I'm actually taking a vacation. Yay!
First time in like 2 years, bro.
First time, 3 years actually. Wow. And yeah, so I'm going to South Africa and London. It'll be really fun. So you probably won't see me the next 2 weeks, but have fun out there.
Yeah, I'll be saving up lots of questions for when he gets back.
Yeah. Ian will still be here.
Or try my best to answer. You know, see how it goes. Gotta get my wing sometime, right?
Yeah.
One quick question, Nate. Can I ask one quick question?
All right, go for it. Quickly.
Yeah, in a Google Hangout, in a chat.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a container, a div, there is a table,
Mm-hmm.
and I have a separate scrollable table, something like you have a sortable table in a sync example. But I want for the table to be scrollable inside the container. So I want to run the scrollable table scroll and pass the container into it, so the element, and I want to pass the actual table, which is aliased as like table, for example. So can I pass a DOM element somehow into the event handler or not?
So there's nothing like super wrong with this except that scroll events don't bubble. So Derby uses a very literal it just actually uses like add event listener just as if you called it manually. So when you say on scroll, what it literally does is goes, document or actually says like, div dot like add event listener to the scroll event. So it works exactly like the normal DOM. Some other frameworks, like for example React, actually implements their own system of event bubbling that's mostly compatible with the DOM, but they kind of just implemented it themselves manually. Derby just uses the DOM. So any DOM rules apply exactly the same way. So if you're really confused about what's going on, sometimes the best thing to do actually is just to build a prototype in plain HTML and JavaScript and get that working first, and then you can translate that really easily into Derby. It's just kind of general feedback. But in this particular case, if you're running into issues, it's probably that you're not putting the on scroll on the right element because it doesn't bubble. So it has to be on the element that's actually the scrolled element.
Well, yeah, this is the scrolled element.
Auto on it, or overflow scroll.
Yeah, but I mean that when I run the scroll, the scrollable table.scroll, is it going to take the table from not from the model of the component that I'm currently in? It is going to actually take the aliased DOM element? Because like I was thinking that the table, it is going to just use some field from the local model if I try to pass it like this.
So literally what this code does that you pasted in is that it adds an event listener to div on the scroll event. Yeah. When the div is scrolled, so in this case the div would have to have overflow auto or overflow scroll on it in order to make it scroll. If that were the case, then as you scrolled that div, it would call the scrollable table, which I assume is a component because, it would call the scrollable table, and the reason it has that reference is it makes scrollable table a property on the current component scope, the current controller scope, and so it would call that component scroll method, and it would pass it the element, which in this case would be the div, because the element is the reference to the current element that the listener was added on, and it would pass in table, which would be the table element in this case.
So it is going to pass the actual element. It's not going to try to pass a table.
As on an element makes a reference to an element. As on a component makes a reference to the component.
Okay, cool.
Does that make sense? So you'll get a reference to both the div and a reference to the table element in this particular case.
Yeah, it makes sense. I was just thinking that it is going to grab it from the model.
No, it always will. Oh wait, no, actually you're right. Sorry, I'm an idiot. It will. So that's actually an issue. So I wasn't reading this correctly. Table is going to look for, basically the rule is that if you call a method, it looks for it on the controller. If you get a value, it looks for it on the model. So in this case, scroll is being called. Therefore, scrollable tables looked up on the controller, and as creates the reference on the controller. Whereas table is being looked up on the model because you're getting a value instead of calling it. Like you don't have like parentheses, so you're not calling it, you're just getting it. So table will be looked for on the model and therefore won't be defined in this case. if you want to make it do what I think you want it to do, which is to pass in the element, the way to do that would be to say $controller.table. So $controller is a reference in the model to the current controller.
So getting it from the model through the $controller is going to work. Okay, that's great.
Yeah. So models have a reference to the controller through $controller, and controllers have a reference to the model through .model, right?
That's awesome. Yeah.
So you can always go from one to the other.
Oh, that's cool.
Okay. Yeah, that's very useful case.
Yeah. That's why I added $controller. It's kind of a hidden feature. You should probably add that to the
Okay, thanks.
You should this is actually a really good example, or something similar to this is a really good example. It would be great to add this to the docs. This is a great question.
Okay, so I'll just edit it to have the right solution.
Sweet, yeah.
Can you leave that just the same though? Because I think it's embedded in here.
Well, just copy out the source of the gist and paste it into Hackpad. It'll work okay, I think.
Or you could just make it known. Anyway.
Yeah, you could also fork the gist. Anyway.
I have enough to make this documentable, or to add it to the documentation. It's great.
Sweet.
Cool. I understand.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right, cool. Well, let's
have a good trip, Nate.
Thanks. I will. I'll be closer to your time zone.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, see you guys next week then.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Bye.